Everyday witches emerge from the shadows of secrecy. Broom closets are flinging open and witches are taking flight. Whether you are hiding in your cozy closet or flying with pride, stay for a spell as Witchcasting with Theodora Pendragon and her guests share magical moments, stir the cauldron, and debunk misinformation and misconceptions about paganism, witches, and our wonderful world of magic.
Some would say there is no such thing as a Catholic witch, but today's guest is a Catholic witch, as some would call her. They do exist. Introduce yourself, Sonia, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, absolutely. So I think other people, when they kind of hear about my spiritual practices and my relationship with God, I think sometimes the first words out of their mouth are, well, that kind of sounds a little bit witchy. And so the label Catholic witch is something other people have kind of put onto my journey, and I'm happy to accept it because I know where they're coming from. Other friends have said kind of like white witchy or white magic stuff, but for me personally, I would just identify as Catholic, as a Christ follower. And so thank you so much for having me on here.
All right, so why would people label you as a Catholic witch?
All right. So my spiritual journey has been all over the place. So when I first started realizing that there was something kind of outside of myself, a spirit, God, something calling to me, I think I started finding ways to relate to and connect with God, with divinity, through a lot of the practices that we see in more of like the New Age and what people would identify as witchcraft, things like oracle cards and, various acts of divination and things like that. So I actually was able to kind of establish a connection with what I believe is God through some of these practices that people very much associate with witchcraft and the New Age movement and practices. And so as I was moving through my spiritual journey, because I think we are all constantly kind of walking through our paths, I ultimately ended up finding a real resonance and connection with the teachings of Christ. And that led me into kind of entering officially into the Catholic Church and continuing my spiritual practices there. And for that reason, since I kind of came from these practices that I feel very comfortable with, I feel very connected to God through these practices, I still continue them, some of them, in my practice with the Catholic Church. And there's been some practices that have dropped off because I feel like they're maybe not in alignment with, what the path that I'm on. But there's a lot of practices that I still continue that when I talk about them, people would say, oh, that just sounds like you're a Catholic witch. And so that's why I think the term and the label has stuck.
But you haven't always been Catholic.
Oh, no, absolutely not. So far away from Catholicism, anything Christian. So I actually started off, I'm, in my 30s now, but for most of my life, I would have considered myself an atheist, someone who was maybe mildly agnostic. I enjoyed hearing stories of people that would talk about divine things and God and spiritual realities outside of this material reality. But I never, for the majority of my life, believed in any of it. I considered most of it fairy tales that people convinced themselves of to make themselves feel better when the world really felt scary to them. So I definitely was not Catholic. I was not Christian. I didn't even believe in God for the majority of my life.
So what happened in your journey where all of a sudden you became spiritual?
Oh my gosh, that is such a journey. So a few years ago, about 6 years ago at this point, I was living overseas. I had this great life. I was making good money, traveling every other weekend to exotic locations. And I realized that none of this stuff that I kind of had around me was really fulfilling in any way, shape, or form. And during that time, I believe, God placed in my life one of the great love stories of my life. And it was, I met this guy named John. And John was a U.S. Air Force pilot. And when I met him, all of a sudden, I just kind of, all of the things that I felt I was looking for in the world around me, I found them in this relationship with this guy. And he was everything to me. He was my whole world. And then he actually died in 2018. His plane crashed when he was landing. And after he died, I think he took the world that I knew with him. And at that time, in the first few days of grief, I remember a few people saying to me, you know what, Sonia, you're going to figure this out. You've always, therapy's helped you. You're a strong person. You're so, you're going to be able to figure this whole path out from grief. And I remember thinking to myself, just in complete horror, because I'm inside my own experience, right? No one else is. And I remember knowing in that moment, like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to move forward from this. And I think it was in that moment I had the first real moment of surrender in my life. And through that, all of a sudden, within a few days of John dying, all of a sudden it was kind of like the world around me was interacting with me in a way as if there was something outside of myself. So there was a lot of synchronicity. There were a lot of things that people call signs, moments, things that made me feel like John, who had died, was actually still with me. And not only that, but there was something beyond him that was also helping me walk through my life at that time. So around that time, around 2018, I really started paying attention to this new way of living life, which was just foreign to me. And I thought I had unlocked some sort of evolutionary process in my brain or something. I kept going to science to try to explain the dreams that I was having, things that felt very much like visions, where I was, experiencing, I've seen John and things like that, even though he was dead. And I started realizing, as I started journeying through that path, I started realizing that there just seems to be something outside of myself, which I would call God now. And that's where everything started to kind of turn. And I started to pay attention to what this was. Who was God? How do we interact with this spirit? And that's where everything it was when my eyes were opened at that moment. So grief is what ultimately got me to see this new world around me.
So in your grief, did you ever experience John's presence?
Absolutely. And it was bizarre, because it's one of those things that people, when these things started happening, and there were many different ways that I felt his presence. Sometimes it was through synchronicities and signs, like, the people have stories of quarters and coins being left for them. Peacock feathers and peacocks would show up in all sorts of places. And he, when he was alive, there was like one really funny experience that he and I had together where he was actually posing with a peacock. So of course he was going to use, cardinals would never get my attention, but a peacock would. And so those things started happening outwardly, like in the world around me, these synchronicities, but then also in my sleep, in my dreams, and in my waking states, I started having these moments where I would see him, I would hear him, I would feel like a warm, comforting hand, like take my hand when I was sleeping. And it was bizarre at first. And at first I didn't know what to make of it. I really thought that there was something wrong with my brain. And it wasn't. And luckily, a lot of my friends are deeply spiritual. They would consider themselves more witchy than Christian or anything like that. And they were very affirming of these experiences. And I'm lucky for that, because I was trying to convince myself that these were not happening. And people that were more in organized religions, including Catholics, were telling me to be very cautious of these things. Were telling me that, there might be some evil entities that are trying to trick me and everything like that. So, and that did not feel like what was happening. And also, what also was not happening was this was not an experience that I was just creating. Like, I wasn't manifesting these things for myself. I didn't even know that these things could happen. And luckily it was my more witchy friends, if you would call them, that were just like, this is what it is. The presence of your loved ones are around us. And yes, the spirit, the divine is something that is always at play with you. So I was very lucky to have people like you in my life when these experiences started happening, because I think we all really need people to articulate some of these new things for us. And I did not have the language for it at the time.
And we also want people in our life who understand us, who connect with us, and they understood what you were going through.
And nothing was weird to them, because these were friends who had spent so much time freely in what I would consider the Holy Spirit, right? They might use different terms or words for it. But, it was my mystical friends, my friends that were really contemplative, who had sadly had left all of the organized religions and forms of Christianity because there was no room really for their experience of God in those kind of prescribed religions. And so for that reason, I was able to start walking towards where I am now, which is because of them. I'm very grateful.
You said that a lot of them walked away from Christianity. Mm-hmm. So when you talk to them about it, does it make you think about how you converted to Catholicism and how that works with your spirituality?
Absolutely. And it's something that I'm very mindful of, because I did not grow up Christian. I grew up actually hearing, stories of Hinduism and reincarnation, and my mom is Sikh. And so that's a completely different kind of spiritual worldview, right? So Christianity, I did not have great experiences with Christians and Catholics growing up, but I certainly didn't have a lot of strong, almost in a way like trauma from things that had happened to me in churches, right? And for that reason, a lot of my friends that left Christianity, Catholicism, because it's not just like one set thing, it's so many different denominations. But one thing I was very mindful of is the fact that I had now arrived in a place in the Catholic Church which a lot of my friends associated with harm and things that had harmed them. So I think there was, for everyone involved, this kind of tension where my friends who had always been really supportive of my journey, once I landed on Catholicism, it was hard, I think, for some of them. And it was also hard for me because I was aware. I almost felt like a traitor in a way, that I was landing in this place, this faith, which so many people have negative associations for reasons that are valid in many cases. Did that answer your question? I feel like I might have rambled.
Yeah, you did. And, I think the difference is when we're children, our parents or our caregivers assign us a religion. They say, this is what you will believe. And you chose to be Catholic later on in life as an adult.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's another thing too. My parents, people often ask, they say, well, your parents tried to raise you in a certain faith and religion, and they did, but they also were, I'm very lucky because like with Hinduism and Sikhism, like it's to choose Christianity, to choose to follow Jesus. There's a lot of families that fall apart because it's almost like you're choosing to walk out on your family. But my family just was they were just happy. They're like, oh, good. You finally can connect to God. Like this is not just a fairy tale. And they were not resentful or angry or intimidated by the fact that God had come to me in the form of Christ. Right. So I was very lucky because many of my friends who have converted to different faiths, whether they started out Christian or ended up Christian, it causes tension with their families as well as their friends. And I have been blessed to not have that. Everyone has been very supportive.
Oh, yeah. I hear this all the time with family. Well, if I leave my religion of origin, mm-hmm. then my family will abandon me. They
Right.
will reject me. And that's really sad. It shouldn't be that way.
It shouldn't, because it's also, in my experience and the way that I think of it is, if you have to keep something hidden or kind of keep it in the closet, like your book, amazing book, if you have to keep your practices in the closet, it also robs you and your family members of the ability to really know one another, right? It's not even necessarily that you're not practicing the same faith, but they don't know a part of your spirit, literally, how God is communicating to you and vice versa. And I think that it's very sad, but it's understandable because these faith systems hold very near and dear places to our hearts, right?
Can you imagine how you would feel, which I don't know, maybe someone has tried to tell you this. Can you imagine how you would feel if someone said, oh, why would you want to join a church like that?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So and I have those questions about it all the time, right? So it's sometimes, and I keep trying to, whenever someone was like, well, why the Catholic Church? Why that church? Why, of all the denominations in Christianity and all the faiths and stuff, why that? And I keep trying to, it's interesting because I keep trying to explain to all of my friends who very much understood at first that something was guiding me. I was not finding God and like bringing him to me. There was a hand guiding my heart towards certain places. So when people are like, why did you join the Catholic Church? My answer is because he asked me to. I feel like I was guided into this church. And it's funny. John was Catholic, actually. So a lot of people, when I joined the Catholic Church, they make the understandable assumption that I was just trying to chase after him. And what's ironic about it is I had always had horrible experiences with Catholics. I know that sounds very kind of uncharitable now, but it was the last place I wanted to go, the absolute last place. And I would say that to my friends. I'd be like, if I was going to pick a religion or a church, why would I pick this? Like it's almost as if it's funny, right? Because I'm like, no one thinks it's cool. Like no one's excited to invite their friend over who's feels like she's in a good relationship with Jesus. I'm fully aware of that. And my answer is I didn't choose it. God and the way that, because when I first started joining the Catholic Church, because it's a process, I had a lot of questions and a lot of moments in prayer where I literally just kept saying to God, why did you bring me here? Why here? Like there's a lot. It's kind of like the Catholic Church is kind of like the really beautiful girl that just can't understand why no one wants to date her. And you're like, it's because you're kind of needy. Like you're really needy. And she's just like, but I'm beautiful. And look at all these, I try to do the right thing. So anyway, I'm rambling, I know, but like the Catholic Church, I'd had these questions and I'd ask God, I'd be like, you have to make this very clear to me that you are doing this and that I am not just chasing after John. And it was kind of beautiful because it was within that week of me asking in prayer for God to send me a sign that this is where he wants my heart to go. The Catholic Church has a lot of rites and rituals. And the first thing that they do is they have you do a rite of acceptance where you stand in front of the church and you say that you want to follow Jesus. And the rite of acceptance is your first step. And then your baptism is on Easter the next year, whenever that is. And when they looked at the calendar, both of those days, my rite of acceptance and Easter, which is under the moon's control, right? Those both fell on April 17th, which was John's birthday. So that was to me the sign that was just, God was like, I'm giving you his birthday in a way, like something new is going to be born on this day. So yes, I want you in this church. And so I'm here and I stay, and it's, I'm not going to lie. It's beautiful, but it's difficult because all relationships I think are, and my relationship with God through the church is the same for sure.
That sounds very beautiful. Now because you chose to be Catholic, mm-hmm. You had total control over it. Yeah. And I believe that people who leave their religion of origin to do something else, whether they want to be witchy or they want to just change to a totally other religion. I was Catholic as a child.
You told me.
And, but I didn't have this rite of acceptance. I was baptized when I was a baby, and I only know that because I saw pictures. I don't remember it. It wasn't a spiritual event for me. So that's a big difference because I remember seeing the pictures of your baptism and it looked very beautiful.
Thank you. And I agree completely that it's, I feel grateful that as an adult, I got to enter into this. And I think that's something, that's why some Christian denominations don't baptize babies. They do want kids to be able to make their own decisions and things like that. But the Catholic Church, she's got her way of doing things. And I, from my own experience as an adult convert, I do think that we kind of get we get to remember that experience. And if you were baptized as a child in a different Christian denomination, they don't baptize you again when you join the Catholic Church. And I remember other adults that were going through this process with me. They were kind of, they were like, I wish that I could do this as an adult and everything. So that resonates a lot what you're saying. And it's just the story that the world writes for us, right? Versus the story that we get to co-write with the divine.
Tell me why some people would call you a Catholic witch, though. You've covered the Catholicism, but why would they think you're a witch?
So when it comes to in the Christian traditions, in American Christianity, I think people are very, very hesitant to acknowledge the spiritual reality that is painted in the Christian tradition, which is the world is very spiritual. Like we're constantly in interaction, not only with like the air that we breathe, but with realities that we can't see beyond ourselves. So for me, that was the thing that drew me in, the fact that there was so much, if you actually have the eyes to kind of see it in the scriptures and stuff, there's a spiritual component to our life, spiritual gifts, the gifts of prophecy, things like this, that I had seen in, New Age practices and things like that, which were, it was shocking to me at first that there's people who would consider themselves mediums and people that, see angels and things like that. But then all of a sudden it was my mainly more Protestant Christian friends that were like, that stuff doesn't exist. And once I entered the traditions for myself and read the, scriptures and things like that, I was like, oh, it's all right here. So for me, since that's the part of the faith that really drew me in, literally drew me in, right? Like, so someone dies, spiritual reality is opened up to me. I follow that spiritual reality to the Christian tradition. I'm very comfortable with that aspect of Christianity, which you don't really see a lot in American Western churched Christian traditions. So for that reason, people, when I talk about angels or, Catholics believe in the intercession of the saints, which is something you don't find in Protestant churches most of the times. So intercession of the saints, for anyone who doesn't know that, is the belief that when people die, they're still aware of humanity. They're still aware of their loved ones and the good that they did for people when they were alive. They can, through, the grace of God, still continue to do once they die, all our life to God. And so for me, it was almost like, when I say these things, like, oh yeah, I do believe that John knows where I am. I do believe that my ancestors are aware of what's going on here. I do believe that they're rooting for us. This sounds witchy to people. And I'm like, great, call it witchy. It's Catholic, it's in there. And even just like, what is it? So tarot cards and oracle cards and things like that. When there's a type of prayer in Catholicism called the Visio Divina, I think, which is literally where you communicate with God through pictures, through a painting, through an image. God talks to you through these things. And it's a type of prayer that is beautiful. And it was taught to us in the Catholic kind of catechism classes, that God can communicate to you through nature, through other people, through your dreams, and yes, through the scriptures, which I love the scriptures, but sometimes you want to look at a picture. And I have my mom had a tarot deck growing up, and I didn't know what it was. I was a kid, I didn't believe in it. But I remember one of, in the earlier moments of my grief journey, I liked that tarot deck. I was able to kind of communicate, something was communicating through that deck with me. And for that reason, I have a real attachment to it. And I have a real attachment to other oracle cards and stuff, which have images that speak to me, right? And so I'm definitely more mindful of kind of if someone is going to give me a reading or something. There are some things that have fallen away. I have some and the images on the deck matter to me, right? So there's some images which I'd be like, that's just not something that speaks to me. So it's not like anything goes. It's not like I'll take on anything. But these practices, I heard of them first in like kind of the New Age witchy world, and I recognize traces and glimpses of them, or the fullness of them in some cases in the Catholic tradition. And so when I describe that to people, they will be like, well, that just sounds witchy. And that's fine. People use words because they mean different things to different people.
Now, I love oracle cards
Yeah.
and tarot, and I've had some people tell me that they were evil and they were from the devil. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, so I do think that and I think that you would tell me if you would agree that there are definitely entities, things that we can't see that do not have our best interest in mind. They might be tricksters. They might really try to destroy our spirit. They might try to lead us into paths that are not good for us. So I think and I do think when you have a baser element like a card, right? To me, and I don't know if this is an actual spiritual reality, but this is the way that makes sense to me. It makes sense that a lower kind of vibrating entity would be able to manipulate that in a way or something like that. So I think that there is some truth to any of these warnings, but there's also discernment. You have to think about, I think any reaction or choice that we make based on fear is never the right way. God wants us to be wise about things. And for that reason, if someone, there's someone that thinks that Pokemon cards can lead people astray and things like that. And the list goes on and on and on, unicorns and things like that. And I'm like, okay, let me hear what you're saying, because I'm not going to dismiss it outright. But then sometimes when people are they really will only then just be like, so the only thing that you can use is the Bible. And then you're like, well, can the Bible be used for evil purposes? And they're like, oh, of course. And I'm like, so then there's nothing. Like, there's nothing to. So to answer your question, I would agree that there are malevolent forces that we should be on the lookout for. And if we just think that everything is going to lead to our best interest, which I do think sometimes people are a little bit too, it's just light and love in the world. I'm like, no, there's bad stuff. Like there's evil. So I would agree that there can be some truth to it, but also you need to be wise. You need to discern. And even in scripture and like the Old Testament, you will see the voice of God speaking through oracles that were not, they were not of the Jewish tradition or something like that. And I think that if there is a God, which I think, I believe in, God's going to use whatever method his children are using. So if that's listening to a Britney Spears song or something, of course, like God can talk through that. Can he talk through an oracle deck? Of course. Can he talk through the clouds? I believe so. Yeah. And so that's what I would say. There's some truth to it and we need to be wise. But then we also just don't want to, I think sometimes with the Christian tradition and the Catholic tradition, we give the evil forces, the devil, whatever you want to call them, way more credit than they are due. Because if we do believe that there is an eternal good that is fighting for us, I'm not going to spend majority of my time worried about the devil. Right? Does that make sense a little bit?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ultimately, we have control of ourselves and we have free will.
We have free will, and there are things that we want to be on the lookout for, and we don't just want to. And sometimes, if something feels good or like makes us look cool, yeah, you want to be. Am I pulling oracle cards because I want to look cool to my friends? It's something that I think to myself, and that's not the case. Because I tell them, before I will open up an oracle deck, I will pray to God and the Holy Spirit and ask for wisdom through God. And that's, and some people aren't up for that, understandably, but that has changed, right? I have friends that will work with anything, any entity, any spirit. And I love them. And when they give me information or messages, I listen, but I don't take it all in as just kind of like, oh, it's all to be swallowed whole. I do discern and pull through things. So I would say that just like with Christianity or any tradition, when we use the word witchcraft, right, there's a million different things that could mean to people. And there are definitely practices which I think most people would agree might be harmful or anything like that. But anything that's not harming someone else or in direct harm of others, it's kind of in a pluralistic society like America. Yes, I would want and hope that people can be accepting of people's religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, whatever they may be. And I think because I do believe that there's, if God is writing the whole story of creation, there's always going to be corrections to where there's been kind of like a deprivation or like a distortion of reality. So I do think since in what I know of history, and history is not my strong suit, there's definitely been a lot of times where in the name of God, in the name of Christianity, in the name of Jesus, and Christians have done this to one another as well, there's been distortions in the reality that is around us, which has caused people to harm others, burn witches, hang them. This has happened within the church. There's been saints and things that were killed by, by people who believed in the God that I believe in. So these distortions and reactions to fear, I hope as time goes on do get balanced out, because I think sometimes what happens is we have a reaction to the idea that there's witches in the world, hundreds of years ago. So all these people get burned, all these practices, kind of get pushed away into the back rooms and things like that. And then when the door opens, right, and people are like, hey, I actually practice divination, or I do hear from spirits, as a reaction to kind of the stigma against something like witchcraft, sometimes what I think we're seeing now is not only an acceptance of it, but a glorification of everything in that practice. And I'm not for the glorification of any spiritual walk. I think they all belong in their proper place. But I do hope for, after a certain point, some equilibrium where it's just people accept that, yes, this is something that people practice. This is what they do. This is what they believe. And you can be friends with people through those differences is kind of how I would flesh it out. Because none of my friends, even my Catholic friends, they laugh and they're like, you're super Catholic. You're like Catholic by profession compared to us. And because my relationship with God through the Catholic Church looks very different than every other Catholic that I know, because we're all different people. So to answer your question, I wouldn't want people to celebrate anything over another thing, right? But I would want people to be able to accept that there's a lot more commonality in these practices than we would previously believe. And I think in the Catholic Church and the teachings, you kind of see that more clearly painted out than you would in like a Protestant church or denomination. So I'm not speaking for Protestant churches. They've got a completely different view of authority and stuff in the Christian life. But in the Catholic Church, if you actually read their kind of traditions and what they believe, is they would say that in all faiths in the world, there's going to be glimmers and hints and real light, real truth, if you will. And you can still celebrate where that truth is found, right? So if you're saying, I had a dream of my dead loved one, and I'm saying, I had a dream where my dead loved one came to me too, we can celebrate that together and be like, how beautiful was that? We don't have to test. It's the same truth, right? Like our loved ones are with us. And that's kind of how I would hope it would happen, where it's just, instead of me being like, wait, no, someone who's not in my tradition should not see their dead loved one. Like that's, first of all, I don't believe that. And neither does the Catholic Church necessarily, but it doesn't mean that there aren't Catholics that don't even know that about their own church. And for that reason, they might react fearfully or negatively, or try to take a moment of comfort that people find in another faith, and turn it into the opposite, which I think is you see that a lot in organized religions. People get very almost defensive that people are finding comfort and usefulness outside of what they believe is the only place to find it. And you know what? And maybe my views will change on this as time goes on. I'm not saying I know everything now, but I think that comfort is comfort, and you find it where you find it. So I'd like people to be able to celebrate those things because it's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful thing to see the way that God and the divine works in different paths, which I think that it happens.
Thank you, Sonia. This has been a wonderful show with you as my guest. And I'd like to tell the audience that Sonia has a story in my book, Taking the Flight Out of the Broom Closet, where she goes into a little bit more depth about her journey in a different way than she did today. And you will get to know her a little bit better in the book. Today, I really enjoyed being with Sonia because she has grown even more than when I first met her.
It was so good to talk to you. Absolutely. And I enjoy all the things that you post. Really appreciate the heart and the work that you put into bringing these stories to life.
And you're a part of it.
Yes, of course. It's a team. It's a teamwork effort, right? Like we're all doing this together the best we can.
Yeah, we are. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Witchcasting with Theodora Pendragon. Have a burning question or have a topic you'd love Theodora and her guests to discuss on the show? Contact her through Instagram at Theodora Pendragon. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And help us spread the word by leaving us a rating and review and sharing it with your friends. See you next time, and may your magic always shine.